Now, recorded sound was already around, thanks again to Edison. You see, early in his life, he'd worked as a telegraph operator using the Morse telegraph. And he'd put together some ideas that had already been around for some time in order to make this. It's called a repeating telegraph. The Morse code signal comes in here, and as it comes in, like this, it makes that needle go up and down and make indentations on that piece of paper. When you've recorded the message, you take the bit of paper off, flip it over, put it on this turntable, so that the little indentations have now become little bumps. And when you rotate this disc, the reading head goes up and down over the bumps, and when that happens, the up and down causes on-off electrical contact, and that sends the message out down the wire. The story is that one day Edison heard this thing operating at high speed, and he noticed that it made a sort of musical sound as the reading head went over the bumps. And it hit him that that was how Bell's telephone worked. You spoke at a diaphragm, it vibrated, and you could reproduce that vibration on another diaphragm somewhere else and make speech. So Edison reckoned if he could make a diaphragm vibrate, he could make speech too. All he had to do was to make speech into bumps first. And here's how he did it. He took a diaphragm, put a needle on it, and rested the diaphragm on a strip of tin foil wound around a metal cylinder. As you turned the cylinder, it moved along. So, doing so, he shouted at the diaphragm as loudly as possible, "Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow." Then he wound the cylinder back to the start point, put the needle back in the bumpy groove he'd just made, and this time, when he rotated the cylinder, what had gone in came back out. They got that sound onto film because years before, somebody had noticed that there was a metal called selenium that gave off electricity if you shone a light at it. And the more light, the more electricity. So in 1923, somebody in Denmark got a light to flicker in response to a human voice and then exposed this strip here down the side of a bit of film to that flicker. So the light and dark patches correspond to the changes in the voice. Now, when you screen this bit of film, more or less light gets through that strip and hits a piece of selenium which gives off more or less signals, and that goes into a loudspeaker, and so movies become talkies. And that takes us to the modern invention that ends our story. Because in 1928, a Russian immigrant to America called Vladimir Zworykin took that selenium idea one stage further. He realized that if you made a square plate made up of rows and rows and rows of thousands of tiny little bits of light-sensitive metal and pointed the plate at a scene, each tiny bit of metal would react to a tiny bit of the scene. It would be like dividing a scene up, let's say, of my face into thousands of little squares. Each tiny bit of light-sensitive metal would see darkness or darkness or darkness or half light or a lot of light or a great deal of light, and would give off a corresponding signal. Nothing, 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 something, a great deal more, a lot of signal, and so on. Now, if you use those signals to reconstruct the picture line by line by using a fluorescent screen that reacted to the signals by producing a tiny dot of light that was more or less bright, you'd get this. Come a great deal closer, you'll see what I mean. This area here, look, on your television screen. You see all those lines of dots? So, television is where this particular chain of events brings us to in the end. Well, not quite the end. It's ironic that the story of how television happened should have been told here in Edison's laboratory. Television tells us every day that we live in a world we don't understand, and yet in the main it does little to explain that world. It tells us of new products that make the products we have either old-fashioned or obsolete. Above all, if today we are aware of how fast the world around us is changing, it's because television acts as a relentless reminder of that fact. Planned obsolescence, the reason you buy a new model because they don't make last year's anymore, affects the way we get our information too. I mean, take a look at the newspapers and the TV programs of 20 years ago. And you can see how much more slick, more brief is today's treatment of the world we see. Communications technology has made it possible for us to see very much more, but we still only have the same amount of time to see it in. So does that fact accelerate change? The fact that we can be more quickly saturated by an idea or a product or an event? Does this cycle that goes interest in something, involvement in it, tiring of it and rejecting it and looking for something else, get shorter every decade? That shouldn't surprise you. Over 90% of the technologists and scientists and advertisers and salesmen that have ever lived are alive now. And they've all got a job to do, haven't they? I said it was ironic that we should be here because that overwhelming rate of change has come directly from the work of Edison and men like him. Edison invented inventing, here at the world's first industrial laboratory, and he laid down precise rules for it. Is there a market for the invention? Get financial backing before you start. Publicize the whole thing in advance so when it comes out the consumers are ready to pay for it. And plow every penny you make back into making more inventions. And that is how the modern world works. So, if you believe that science and technology have given us the highest standard of living in history, or that they have trapped us inside a machine we can't escape from, we live in a situation we inherited as a result of a long and complex series of events through history. At no time in the past could anybody have known that what they were doing then would end up like this now. So, the next and last program looks at whether or not we want to go on into the future like that. And if not like that, like what? And I hope to show that you can only know where you're going if you know where you've been.